I'm John Travis in Novato, California on the 3rd of June, 2020, talking to Phyllis Klaus in Palo Alto, just down the road. And it's been at least 20 years since we've seen each other, Phyllis. I've been tracking you from afar and aware of you're still fighting the good fight, and delighted that I could track you down and record this interview. I want to find out more about who you are and why, and also your connection with Marshall and even John Kennel, and the work that you pioneered way back when and the importance of that. But let's start with where you were born, where you grew up, siblings, what led you into, I believe social work is your
Actually,
career.
psychology, psychotherapy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I have the MFT and California license, and the social work license I got in Michigan. I was working in a hospital for 5 years, so I'll tell you about that later. But
We'll get there. Okay.
First I want to say that we are having this interview in a very sensitive time and an important time in our culture. And half the time I've been watching TV and weeping over the terrible things that have come to a head in our lifetime here, and that should have been solved years ago. It's so sad to think of, George Floyd and what happened to him and how people are still being mistreated. And it's interesting for me because my parents were so open and loving, and my mother had very severe diabetes, which she got when she was pregnant with me. And that's why I like sugar so much, they said.
Oh.
My pancreas was working for hers, so I was getting extra sugar. Anyhow, at that time, in that era, because of the illness she had, she wasn't allowed to work in many places. Even volunteer work, they didn't always, it was like a judgment on some prejudice.
Really?
But she could work she worked as a volunteer in a little nursery school in the inner city in Cleveland. And she took me, and my best friends were little African-American children who for me were just my friends, And I said one day, I heard somebody say something mean about a little black child. And I said to my mother, why aren't people born blind? If they were born blind, they wouldn't have to say things like that. I could understand that something was wrong with that. And my dad had a little printing business, and he hired whoever could do the job. And half the people he hired were African American, and then a couple women who he had in positions of authority, all of them. He with the printing, so on. And he, in fact, he was so upset at how people were treated in unions and stuff. The unions were blackballing his little company because he had all these fair practices, and he created profit sharing with the whole little company. And so I grew up with those kind of beliefs and that kind of, so I, seeing all these marches and everything, for me, I started marching on Washington quite young. And I remember marching for the Indians, and most recently the Me Too movement. I've done a lot of work in that area, but for civil rights. And when I started getting my master's degree, it was at Kent State University after the killings. And some of the kids who were injured, in fact, Robbie recently died as an older man now, but they were my friends. And Robbie Stamps, he was walking from the library holding all these books across campus, and he was shot by the Ohio National Guard, So it's so interesting to do this interview at this time in history. And I'm thinking, what has changed? What still needs to be done? And why is there such cruelty to people? So for me, this leads into talking about my beautiful husband, Marshall Klaus, because he really had just such love and appreciation in his heart for human life. He lost his parents very young.
Can we go back to where you were born first and get a little more of your childhood, and then we'll pick
Okay.
this up and
I want to
join
talk
them
about
together.
it.
You're from
Right.
Ohio then?
But I was born in Cleveland, Ohio. My
Uh-huh.
parents were born in Cleveland, Ohio. Grandparents came from Europe somewhere. It'll be interesting to follow that one day. But everybody was grateful to be here. And, um, I just grew up as a kid with playmates from the neighborhood. And we lived in, at one point, we lived in actual Cleveland, Cleveland. And then we lived in Shaker Heights, which was where my parents had their first house. And the neighborhood was just sort of middle class families, very nice, except that I have the different religions in my family. But I do remember one day, I'm 5 years old. A lot happened when I was 5 years old. And I'm walking to school with my brother and this little boy who I knew because he was in my kindergarten class. And he said, "Oh, there goes a dirty Jew." And it was like, oh my God, what does that mean? That was so devastating. Um, Anyhow,
Yeah.
so that made me feel that I could never discuss religion. Even though my parents were very open, we have different religions in our family and different members of the family of different religions. So for me, if there's, I began to see the both the humanity and the spirituality in people very young. And that to me was very soothing because I had an experience when I was about, I don't think I was 5. I think I was 6 by then because I was taking tap dancing lessons down in downtown Cleveland. And my mother sent me on the rapid transit, which was the train that would go from the Heights down into the city. And the teacher would meet me at the other end. So it never occurred to my mother that there was anything wrong with that. It didn't to me either. I felt very proud of myself that I could go by myself on the train with my little dancing shoes. And of course, I found out that the conductor was always looking for me. So I wasn't really alone. But one day the train always went through the hardest part of town. So when you think of LA with the Watts era and
Hmm.
ways of living, well, in Cleveland, it was called Huff, the Huff area. But I didn't know that that's what it was at that time. And I remember that the train stopped on this stop. And I could see that the houses were sort of wrecked and old cars and poor people. But it looked to me, I had this moment where every single thing was bathed in golden light. It was like so beautiful. And I thought, everything is connected. We're all the same. I didn't understand it then. I do more now. But it was so beautiful. I just felt
Wow.
peaceful. I felt so happy with it all. And so I realize now that, I was tapping into this energy of the universe, which is a lot of my work today with holistic thinking. But I think it was really good that I had that experience because I wasn't afraid. I was just like joyful, like this was an incredible thing. Later, years later, I created a program called CULT, Cleveland Urban Learning Community, where I and got some other teachers. We got the older kids involved. Street kids had a place to go to get schooling, and I was training the teachers in counseling skills. At that time, I had a school counselor degree, and kind of interesting how these things come around again and fit
Yeah.
with our thinking. And now I'm doing a lot of energy work, which now there's much more study about human energy
Hmm.
and how we can heal with it and help each other with it. So, but those are some of my beginnings. I do remember trying to drag little children home for lunch with me because I thought they were lonesome. And my poor mother, she always had a nice lunch. She used to cut the bread with cookie cutters, so the bread had pretty
Oh,
different shapes for sandwiches. And I thought all the kids should come with me. Um, and so I do remember that I got into trouble because you have to find out from their parents if they can come for lunch. You can't
oh,
just drag them home with you. So my mother was always ready with the names and numbers of the people in the class, depending on who I came home with. Um, but I went to school at Lowmont Elementary, but for 2 or 3 years of my elementary years, my dad had this printing company, but he did work in California because my grandparents, my mom's parents lived in California, and we would go visit them. And every now and then my dad would think maybe he should try to do some business in California because you could avoid the winter. Um, and I think really struggling and shoveling snow and stuff in the depth of winter, along with the fact that he smoked, um, probably caused his demise at 50 when he had a heart attack.
Mm.
But at any rate, you think about those things. I wish we could have changed some things then. But my parents, if you go in your life and you see people who really are a couple that you really know love each other. I've only seen like 3 in my life, and my parents were one of them. They
Mm.
were so, in fact, once I got mad at my mother and I yelled at her, and my father said, honey, that's my wife you're talking to, and I'd like you to be more respectful. So what am I going to say? Oh, I won't, I really thought about that. And he never yelled. He said, when I would do something that was not quite right, he would say, he would call me Princess. Princess, um, there's the right way to do things and the wrong way to do things. And it's really better to do the right way. And you know what? It's a lot easier. So I really had to think about that. What did he mean by that? But it began to make sense,
Mm.
um, but that's how he would try to discipline me. So I
Did you
felt
have siblings?
my dad, I had one sibling, a wonderful brother. So when I was born, he was 3 years old. He
Uh-huh.
was so excited to have me that my mother said, "Here, she's yours." So he took care of me a lot. I mean, he did everything I asked of him, poor kid. I asked him to pretend he was a dog. So he would go woof, 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 and I had to put a leash around him. Poor guy. He put my clothes away. He put my shoes very neatly in the closet. He hung up everything. And of course, that was a big mistake because I really needed him later in years to keep my room neat. Um, and that wasn't always the case. So I actually was raised very lovingly, and I'm lucky. It was
Yeah.
a shock to me to see how children were treated as I got older, you
Mm.
know. So that's some of my early beginnings. What
So you,
else?
you went through grade school in Cleveland and high school also?
Yes, yes, yes. I was valedictorian of the class,
Oh,
and
congratulations.
that was kind of fun, all A's. And then I went to a wonderful college. I went to Vassar College, and then I met my first husband, um, actually in Cleveland, and got married a year before graduation. But I finished college. I had gotten pregnant with my first child, who was born on my first anniversary of the marriage. But that's 3 weeks after graduation. So I
Wow.
old pictures of me walking down the aisle in graduation, pregnant with John. And but having lived in a very intellectual life at that point, and my son John is very interested in reading and intellectual discussions, and I'm sure that you know caused some
Hmm.
um, effort for him, or some sort of way of being. So I want him to have more fun. He's usually got his head in a book, which is okay. But at any rate, so when he was a medical student, when he graduated from medical school, we moved to Chicago. So actually, John was actually, all my 3 children were born in Chicago. So I had very little chance to sort of get acclimated. Um, it was just we moved, and he was born 4 days later.
Wow.
So, and then I had the 3 children within a year each one, which I wouldn't advise actually to have them so close together. I
Yeah,
think
that's
it's too a little hard. But
too hard on you.
yeah, so there were interesting experiences in Chicago. And let's see what would, and then when we were finished with Chicago, he had a fellowship in Atlanta, Georgia. Okay, this is going to the South in 1960.
Wow. Yeah.
And I can tell you that was a rude awakening. um, I remember one of the baby got sick, and I had to call a cab because we only had one car, and my husband had it because he drove to the fellowship place. And I called a cab because I looked in the phone book, and this cab driver drives up. Now, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. Okay, I really had no experience of the South. And the very nice driver sees me and he says, "Lady, I can't take you anywhere. Do you want us both to get killed?" And I said, he happened to be African American. That didn't mean anything to me. I grew up with that, my friends and so on. And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "This is the South, lady. This is 1960. Okay, so civil rights had not come in yet."
Mm-hmm.
And I started to cry. I said, "This is terrible. It's just a cab. I'll pay you, in advance." I didn't know what to say. I couldn't believe it. It was so painful to hear that. He said, "We would both be killed if I'm taking you in a cab." He said, "Let me call a white cab for you, and they'll come right away. Don't worry." But that was my introduction to the lack of civil rights and why my life was so different in Cleveland. And my parents, I had Black friends in school. I had, this was totally, you only read about this, and then to
Mm-hmm.
realize people lived this. The schools were segregated, everything was segregated. And then now I had a new baby and the two little ones, and just, I'm afraid to use the telephone. It's like, if you need to call somebody. So that was very painful to see that. So I started to get this fire in me that we've got to fight against these horrible things. So to come to rights happening now today with George Floyd and the tragedy of that man's life, and to have seen it, I watched it. It breaks your heart, and it
Mm-hmm.
slams against everything that's of humanity, of what you know. So anyway, I get glued to the television, of course, watching this today. And here you are interviewing me about something that's so beautiful: mother-infant bonding, parent-infant relationships, bringing a new life into the world, wanting that life to have freedom and joy and health, wanting that family to have everything possible for them to make life have happiness, and having the beginnings that I had, which were so real to me, and trying to live my life that way. So why hasn't this changed?
Yeah.
You know, and then to have been, being back in Ohio again with the Kent State shootings, the Ohio Guard being called to murder children. I mean, ah,
So you went back to Kent State from
right.
Georgia?
Well, actually, back in Chicago, and then Atlanta, and then in the interim period was the Navy. My husband had to go in the Navy, and we were in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And that was the time when the Thresher went down, the atomic submarine, which was never found. And two of my neighbors were lost in it, junior lieutenants in the Navy, and the women were left with their children and babies. And that
Mm-hmm.
was horrendous, the horror of that kind of situation, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's interesting to think of those points of time in one's life that you are witness to, and not really having real power to change it.
Mm-hmm.
But our best friends in Portsmouth were happened to be an African American family, and they were officers in the Navy, like Fred was, my ex-husband, and they wanted to go home for Christmas, and they relayed to us how horrible it was. Here they are, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on a Navy base. Everybody is open and friendly and intermingling. And they have to go in the back door to the bathroom at a McDonald's, so the contrasts were so, at some point why hasn't there been real change? You can understand people's anger. You can understand their hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And to live it and see it. And finally to live long enough that you can see good things, of course, that happen. But this, what need I say more? I think we're all, I work with people that have beliefs like me. So
Mm-hmm.
because I have a client whose parents are strong Republicans, and they believe everything that they hear on Fox News, and I shouldn't bring in politics, I can't help it. But, you have to accept people for where they're at. And if they believe things that aren't true, I don't know how to fight that,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you went from New Hampshire in the Navy then to Kent State?
Then back to Cleveland, right?
Cleveland. Mm-hmm.
Which was where we lived and the children grew up. And that's when Kent State happened, because this is 1962 now, say, to 64. Oh, I had a year of living in France. He had a fellowship with a famous doctor in Bordeaux, France. And I happened to have been a French teacher. So, so this was great. So my studies at college were French and Spanish, and also child study and psychology. So I put these things together when I went into teaching as a profession. So in France, this was a wonderful experience. The French people were wonderful, and this was good for my language skills. And the kids got a little bit, although I put them in a nursery school, and I never checked it out. I didn't realize that they weren't happy. I just thought, wonderful, they're going to get French. And they had about 90 children in this preschool and about 2 teachers. So it wasn't really very happy for them. And they couldn't speak the language really. And I didn't see that, I'm thinking this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. I wish I had French schools. So that was hurtful to them. And also, let's see, I'm trying to think which year was which. Anyhow, that was part of my experience. Then we're back in Cleveland. So there were a lot of moves.
Yeah, you got around. And the Kent State shootings were in the spring of 70, as I recall.
Yeah, that's right.
And
And
you were then doing graduate work?
when did I go? Yeah, I finished it. I took a long time to, oh, wait a minute. I went back, I started to teach in Cleveland, and I taught in a school way out in the country, and it had a microcosm of America. It was African American from a small community that was gerrymandered out of the Cleveland County during the war for factory work. They didn't even have sidewalks. A lot of the kids were in my school district. Wealthy landowners outside of Cleveland with beautiful ranches and stuff like that. And then poor everyday people who worked in these places. So it was a really great microcosm, and I developed, with my colleagues, I developed a very exciting language program. We called it Real Communication, so that it was learned, the goals of it, and it was the first book I wrote called Real Communication in French, was communication, that language should be communication, not just memorization.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take a verb like to be, you don't just say I am, you are, he is. Who are you? I am, and Susie speaks directly to Susie. Susie, who are you? And I'm a mother, I'm a daughter, I'm a friend, I'm a, scholar, I'm a student. I'm a kid who likes jokes, so helping develop a sense of listening to each other and finding out things that are meaningful. So this was an exciting program, and I took a lot of trainings at that time. I went all over the country to learn things about humanistic education and humanistic psychology, which was burgeoning at that time. And
Just,
I
yeah,
took,
the 70s,
yeah,
that was a
yeah,
big thing.
very wonderful time. And then I also studied meditation methods, transcendental meditation, and that was, I took 3 days of training in that. And when I was finished with that, I never yelled at my children again. It was like very interesting how powerful that method is, you know.
Mhm.
And but my marriage was not working well for a lot of other reasons, and so I got divorced, and you know, that happened. That was very sad. Um, then about 10 years later, I ran into Marshall, and this was kind of interesting. We had met him 10 years earlier, just almost by accident, because his Marshall's brother and my ex-husband were in the same uh, class together and met at Case Western Reserve. And just by chance, my ex-husband, you know, we had kept, I hadn't really known them at all. He knew them before we married even. So, um, but my parents wanted to give me and my husband a little trip to California because I had relatives in
Mhm.
California. And my ex-husband thought of looking up this person, Marshall Klaus, because his brother had mentioned that he lives in California. And I didn't know really any of them, but I now knew the name. And so when we got to California, we happened to call Marshall Klaus, and they invited us to a little visit. Had a lovely family, a lovely wife, and that's all I knew, that he was a pediatrician. So I didn't see him again. This was like 1961 or something. I didn't see him again for 20 years, almost 20 years. And
Mm.
then I ran into him. I had an office in Cleveland now, and I had a license as a psychology, you know, there's a word, not an intern, but a consultant. And there's a license piece. I can't think of the name right now, but anyhow, in Ohio. And I was working with a really neat psychologist, and I was, you know, developing my interest in mind-body work and some of the burgeoning changes in therapy that were happening instead of just psychoanalytic or talk
Mhm.
therapy. And so I was using all these trainings I was going to and starting to bring them into the language. So I'm trying to think of a good. I spent programs in the summer at the National Humanistic Education Center in the Adirondacks, and this was where values clarification and a whole lot of wonderful ways of thinking and solving problems was taught. And I could apply it all in the language because it's all related to human development and interaction and communication. Um, that year, I also went and spent a summer in Cuernavaca, Mexico, and studying with Ivan Illich, who was a very famous, wonderful priest who was um, not excommunicated because he wanted to teach the clergy and all the wonderful things in Latin in the language of the people. So he was sort of excommunicated because of some of those beliefs. Brilliant, wonderful man.
Yeah, I
He
remember a book by him in the 70s was a very big
and
deal. I've forgotten the
famous,
title.
yes, and I can't think of him. This is my memory now in my 80s. Wonderful. And so he would give lectures every day and talk and had great people come, Jonathan Kozel, John Holt, you know, a lot of people involved in education at the time. They came as guests. So I got such an influx of thinking and emotions and values and, you know, struggling with all these issues and how to bring them into the classroom and how to bring them into my therapy. And I brought my eldest son with me thinking this would be a good experience for him. And an elderly person who lived in the housing where we lived from America, a very fine man, sort of took John under his wing. By this time, of course, my marriage was not working, and John really had been very hurt by the marriage because my children did not get the kindness from their father that they should have gotten. which was very sad. And I'm always trying to fill it in, but it's never enough. And at any rate, so what else about me?
Well, just to fill in your education, you went back and did graduate work
Yeah, then I
prior to
was
opening
working.
your office.
Right, right. So I got my master's degree in counseling education and counseling psychology. And that was very valuable because at Kent, at this time, they changed the entire program after the shootings and what that meant to the community and to the kids, and to make something meaningful out of that so people can learn from it and grow. So the professors were unbelievable, and they brought in famous people like Hans Selye,
Mm.
who developed the whole concept of the general adaptation syndrome of stress. A lot of famous people. We had a week with Virginia Satir. We had a week with Salvador Minuchin. We had, all these famous people in family dynamics and interpersonal development, Gestalt people. What was his name? Albert Ellis, rational
Wow.
emotive therapy. So we
A
really got
lineup.
a taste of everything. Murray Bowen. Um, I was very lucky. They wanted us, infused us with a whole range of different ways of thinking about human behavior and human beings. And it fit where I was coming from, so it was very meaningful to me. So having had a year in France at the University of Bordeaux, which was good for me because they had a special program for foreigners, not good for my kids, but there I am now in Mexico with a very rich program. And there was a time we're watching one of the famous Mexican artists, Siqueiros, I think, and we're watching him paint these magnificent murals and, all the things that were going on in Mexico. Anyhow, so this was good for Spanish, which I also love. So now I'm going to come back to Cleveland, and I want to bring this into the classroom. And that's when I developed this real communication. And my fellow teachers were right with me, and all of them very thoughtful people. We had French, Spanish, and Russian because we had teachers in these three languages in that school. And this school was, so I developed the program without grades. It was based on what you knew. Your grade of pass or fail was, did you understand it? Did you learn it? Did you get the principles of the language? Can you speak it? And I developed programs where we went all over the city where they were going to use their language. So we went to a market, and I had called the market and said, these kids are going to ask for things in French. So I might have a sign, this is what they're saying. And we went to the museum in Cleveland, wonderful museum, and to many things because I wanted them to be broadened in their thinking rather than way out in the country in this little town where Kenston was. So then I developed a program where I could take the kids, and we could, all the three teachers, take the kids to a country which spoke the language. So for the 4 years, every year, we had a month in another country. For me, it was twice in France, and twice it happened to be the French West Indies, which was Guadeloupe. And that was an amazing contrast for these children. The poverty of the French West Indies and the way of living, again, very powerful, lots of lessons learned. And I remember once we were climbing Mount, what was it called, Soufriere, and it was a volcano. And so it started to blow up rocks. And so I'm responsible for these children. They're all 15 years old, 15 and 16. I had, anyhow, like 10 children. And I said, be sure you have a partner and crawl down so you don't get hit with a rock. We have to crawl, be careful. And then we finally get down, but it was scary. And later when we got back to Cleveland, the whole thing blew up, which thank God we missed that, but
Wow.
it was very scary. The other things that were scary is that I learned how different mores, different customs related to men and women. I thought that we're speaking French and we're so excited to know the language, and you say, bonjour, monsieur, bonjour, madame, hello, hello, ça va, how goes it? Trying to practice a language, just walking down the street. Mistake. You don't do that. You never do it if you're a woman, because I'm just really my friendly self. And this little car, Dauphine, stops, and two great big guys get out, and they have machetes in their hand, and they start chasing me. I tell you, I should have won either the Indy 500 or the Olympics. I ran so fast to where I lived. I would have beaten anybody in a race, let me tell you. And I get in the door, and where I'm living, the landlord is a very sweet woman. She's unlocking 10 locks. Now I understand why they have all these locks on the doors. And she pulls me in and closes it all up. And then I tell her what happened. This is the second time in my life I heard a French person say, cela ne se fait pas. Oh, that isn't done, Phyllis, which means whatever I did was wrong. And a single looking lady never speaks to a man, that she doesn't know. Never. It's just not done. It's an invitation. I had no idea of that. So culture, it's important to understand cultural differences, if you will.
Yeah.
But the people were wonderful to us, and I had another major interesting experience with kids. Let me tell you this one. I had really several others, but this is with these kids. And of course, my responsibility is that they're safe. And one of them actually went blind. It was a conversion reaction. There was nothing wrong with her eyes, but she couldn't see. And what happened, and I never knew that she had that before. We get a family that the child is healthy, that everything is safe for them to travel, all of that stuff. And I had all that. And what happened is when she was put in the family, everybody's in a different family, about 8 little African French children just jump on the bed in the morning. They're so excited. They have this little English sister now with them for the month. And she froze. She got terrified. She'd never had anybody do that, and she couldn't speak that well, the language. And these were yet strangers to her. And these darling children whom you would adore, they're so sweet and friendly, and they want to play with you and everything. She absolutely became very, very frightened. And so she went blind. So she had to come stay with me. So I had this one little cot, which we managed to divide up, and one bulb of light at night. And so, during the day it was fine. At night, if you had to get up to go to the bathroom or something, you turned the light on, you had 1,000 cockroaches. So I'm one of these people that if I used to see any bug in my cupboard, I threw everything out. I had to clean it all with spray and everything. Well, after a while, you get friendly with the cockroaches. You can learn how to manage anything. And by the way, cockroaches are one of the oldest living things on Earth. I think they can live, like 100 years or whatever. They will respond. Did you ever read that wonderful writer Peter Matheson? Maybe on his trip, he took a cockroach as a pet. And every time he came to feed it, it would come to the edge of the glass of the jar and like wave to him. So they respond. Isn't that interesting? I love that story.
I didn't know that.
Anyhow, this poor kid, so we had to call her parents, and I just took care of her until we got home, of course. So by the way, the kids had worked all year on bake sales and stuff to earn their money for the trip, okay? And which wasn't very costly, but it was still something, and we gave money to the families too. Okay, so now when we're ready to go home, we have to travel from Guadeloupe to Haiti, and then to, I think, Puerto Rico, I think Cuba, I'm not sure, and then Miami. Anyhow, we had these little planes until we got to American Airlines and Miami. Okay, so in Haiti, this is the time of Papa Doc, who owned the island, and there are like 20 people with machine guns all lined up. And I think I have to take care of these kids, you know. And I just said, be polite, you know, just whatever they say, just do, you know. And it turned out that there was a French nun from Canada, from Quebec, who had made arrangements for adoption for, I think, 8 little children, starving children from the island of Tortuga. And she had people with helpers and bottles of formula. And she was asking our pilot in this little plane if he could take her and these babies who had no identification, but when she got to Miami, they would have all the identification waiting. And he said, well, he has no room. So I looked at the French students of mine and I said, what do you think, kids? Can we help her? They all wanted to help. These are really nice kids. And so every 2 of them took a baby. And so now these babies looked like 6 months old because they were so starved and so diminished in size. And they could talk French. And so my French students were saying, you know, elle parle français, she speaks French. Il parle français, it speaks French. You know, they couldn't believe it. So the baby's French was better than my kids, you know. But they had learned a lot of French living with the family for a month. And so it was so cute. So, and by the way, these babies are starving, you know, so they would drink that so fast, and we had to, the nun had to teach them very slowly because they could get very sick, you know. And so the babies are starving. They're getting a little bit at a time of formula, and my students are helping. This was an incredible experience for them. So then we get to Miami finally, and the goal was to get them to French Canada, to Air Canada. And so we had to go through customs. Another learning experience. All the Guadalupean families had given gifts to the students to take home to their parents, but gifts from the land, only that they have coconuts,
All right.
sugar cane, homemade rum, you know.
Not going to get through customs.
Now we have to get through customs. And I'm trying to explain to the customs that these poor families gave of their hearts these nice gifts. Are you sure they can't, you know? So, and they didn't have identification. You know, they didn't even have anything with their names on it. So the customs, and I'm explaining all this, you know, and the nun is trying to explain. She doesn't speak English. She only speaks Canadian French. And so anyhow, I'm trying to really be very diplomatic and do this, and you know, there's such a nice family, and they wanted to give gifts to the American children, and blah, 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 blah. And finally, the poor man says, "Oh, it's okay, just go. I don't see anything. I don't know anything. Just go." And he was so sweet. And then he said to me, "Do you know how to open a coconut?" I said, I think so. He said, with these little holes, you just pop them and then you drink the juice first and then you open it. It was so sweet, you know. So, okay, we get them all to Air Canada. They're all expected. They have little visas for them. And the nun was so grateful, and she hugged all of us, and the kids had already made little friendship with these little children, and they gave them all a big hug and kiss goodbye. Anyhow, these are such rare moments, you know, in a person's life. You
Yeah.
read about that, but it was really fun. So those are some of my adventures. But I tell you, that's one more. When I graduated from college the year before, actually, my parents sent me to France on the Experiment in International Living, which was a wonderful program. Eventually, it became the Peace Corps, and Sergeant Shriver ran it. But it was where you live with the family and you spend the whole summer, all go on a trip together, and then you have a week in Paris. And this was really wonderful. So I lived with this wonderful French family, and they lived in a little house on the top of a hill, and it was called La Citadelle. And it had a vantage point of seeing the entire area, huge, all, you know. It was about 16 kilometers from Switzerland. during the war, the minister, it was a Protestant part of France. And this was the first time that I had seen the Protestant Catholic problem, which I never knew existed in France. Except, I mean, you read about it from history, but not knowing it. And so the French families would say, now don't go into those stores, go into these stores, you know, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, you know, they've just lived through a horrible war. And by the way, they had walls where, what are the, like, heroes of the war that were trying to help the French, free the French, or save people, were shot by the Germans. And the Germans used the school, which was right across the street from the house we were in, as their headquarters, because they could see everything. And every now and then they used to take a machine gun and just over all the houses right across the street, including the house that I was in. So these people had real memories of what war was like. The father of the family had been, like all the French fathers, were sent to Germany to work in factories. So the women were left alone with the little children. And so this is 1953. Yeah, I was a freshman in college, that's right. This was a gift to me after high school graduation. Okay, so are you interested in this? You can cut a lot of this if you are, you know.
Well, I'd like to get on to, we
So
mentioned
what I would,
Marshall,
right,
but
right.
it sounds like you've had such a broad
It's been neat, yeah.
experiences. It really brings a
Well,
lot of richness to your story.
yes, I'm going to just wrap this up because in 53, I'm in France as a group of Americans and learning about what happened during the war and all of these things. In 73, I take my first group of American children to live in France for a month. And we live in a little town outside of the city of Rouen, which is where Joan of Arc was burned at the stake. This little town had never had any Americans. This is in Normandy. This is Normandy, France in 73. And my students, this is another group of students, not the ones from Guadeloupe. And this is the first Americans in this part of Normandy since the bombing of France, of the invasion of Normandy. And these kids were so welcomed with a red carpet at the train to greet us. And, you know, and every one of these families had lost somebody killed by the American bombers coming to save them. So these concepts and things to discuss and to recognize and to feel living there were very powerful. That's the end of my stories and my beginnings, okay? Now.
Okay. Well, now you've mentioned Marshall, that you met him early on, and
Yeah, I met him in 79, I think it was.
and how was that?
Yeah, I have an office in this little building above a little restaurant called the Light of Yoga. That's the restaurant. And I'm having one of my clients, an old client, came to visit me for a bit, and she said, could we have a cup of soup down in the restaurant? Everything is all very pure in the little restaurant. And so we were down there, and I happened to walk by a table with Marshall and a very nice woman who had been a former client of mine and a nursery school teacher. And I thought to myself, I think that's Marshall Klaus. Oh, isn't that nice? He must be divorced or something, and he's sitting with a nursery school teacher who I knew and liked very well. And oh, isn't that nice? Because he's a pediatrician. That's interesting. Didn't think a thing about it. Went about my business. Later, the next day, my colleague who was managing the phones for us calls me and she said, Phyllis, please answer your phone. This pediatrician by the name of Marshall Klaus has called 3 times and he's given 3 different numbers. So I'm going to give them to you. Would you please give him a call? And I thought, well, that's interesting. So I called him. The first thing I said to him, are you going with that woman? I called her by name. And because if you are, I don't I believe in women's rights, and so I'm not going to date anybody who's going with somebody else. And he said, the truth is, this was a blind date. She's a very nice woman, but it's not going to go anywhere. And people fix people up, all the time. And I believed him. He was very sincere. He said, I'd like to meet you again. So, c'était le début de notre amour. That was the beginning of our love affair, if you will.
He
Because,
spotted you then, yeah.
isn't that nice?
So then how did it develop? How did you wind up
Well,
married?
he called me. He said, "Could we go out to dinner?" And we did. And it was kind of one of those, the feeling of love at first sight. But then we really got to know each other, and we went together for 2 years until we got married. And then at that time, he was going to move out of Cleveland, where he was a major professor of pediatrics and had done a great deal of wonderful work already. And we moved to Michigan, where he became chairman of pediatrics. And he had never wanted that role because he didn't want the administrative role. He really was a researcher
Mhm.
and a pediatrician and a neonatologist, and really wanted the research role and the caregiving role. But he wanted to try it. People really asked him, and this was a pretty new department, and he could do a lot of good training of things in this department. And I got a position in the family practice department in the School of Medicine. So that became an opportunity, and I got a license in Michigan as what's called a master social work license. So I could see patients and I could have a private practice. And that was a very good opportunity for me because I began to develop my knowledge of medical problems with pregnancy and how they could be resolved psychologically, many of them, and certainly along with medicine if it was needed. So this was a way for me to deepen my understanding of mind-body therapy and holistic thinking, which is really my work in life. And Marshall and I began to, by that time, he had done his first studies on the doula. And this became a major work of information, of study for Marshall and his colleague, John Kennel, and our colleague. So we actually, when I began to learn about the doula, I had not known about the doula, except when I met Marshall. And then I also began to learn about his studies in bonding and breastfeeding. And I mean, he was really the initiator of major changes in parent-infant connection and
Yeah.
bonding. That was so valuable what he did. And he and John together did so much in that, but each of them had been doing some of it separately. Marshall had started in California at Stanford, where he worked as a professor of pediatrics, and he had been working on the lung earlier at UC San Francisco on the surfactant of the lung, which had not yet been developed, and he was part of the people that developed it. That was the illness that killed the Kennedy baby because the baby was premature and didn't have this substance in the lung. So
Mhm.
Marshall spent a number of years studying that and helped form that substance that was needed. So that was, and by the way, he went into pediatrics. He had some major hardships in his life, which helped him develop the sensitivities I think that he had. He had that just naturally in his personality. But his dad died when he was 6, and his mom died when he was 11.
Mhm.
And he was put to a very good uncle for the first years after mom died, his mom, who was very sweet and loving. But his mother had breast cancer, which they had no help for in those years. And she also went blind from the traveling metastatic aspect of the disease. So I think his interest in eyes and being able to have the parents look en face, as it's called, face to face, and let that baby see your face was very, very important to him. And his understanding of the mother's feelings was very profound. I know a wonderful doctor from Canada, who's American and Canadian, Michael Klein, brilliant, wonderful, thoughtful man. And he was studying at Stanford and met Marshall as a professor over, helping him. And the first night he met Marshall, he was working with a premature baby. And the first thing Marshall said to him was, he thought he'd get into all the medical issues about lungs and so on. He said, do you know what the mother is feeling? He got this young doctor at the time right into who is this human being and how is she feeling about this sick baby. And from that, you have to start, because she is the one that's going to bring that baby forward if she feels safe and good about herself and can express her needs and feelings. So this was part of Marshall, who he was as a person. And he got polio when he was 19. He got polio 5 years before they had the vaccine. And here we are in an epidemic now. This man was so sensitive to what it was like to not be able to function. I think he had a short period in an iron lung, and then he lost the complete use of his right arm, not his hand. His hand he could use, so he would be lifting his arm, to shake somebody's hand. It was a dead weight, his arm, and it was his right arm. He was going to go into internal medicine, where you hold up a person's back and you tap against them and you need both arms, and he couldn't do it. So he went into pediatrics and he went into newborn care. This he could manage. He could hold a tiny baby in one hand or even the other hand.
Did he regain the use of his arm, or was
never got the use of his arm? Completely dead. The polio kills the muscles. But he had the use of his hand, so he could lift his arm, use his hand, and hold the baby. He could manage with the use of two hands. And but then, as a student, medical student at Case Western Reserve, he was put in charge of, I think it was like 200 Amish babies who all had polio. They did not know how to treat them. They were doing Sister Kenny's thing, and nothing would change the paralysis at that point, but you could help them in other ways. And so he was very, injured with that, and was in the hospital for a number of months being treated. And his parents were gone. His uncle, who had taken care of him, had died. He was given to another uncle who was actually very cruel and felt burdened by these two boys. Marshall's younger brother was born when his mother was, when Marshall was 5 years older. So little Carl was born, and the dad had died. The mother was sick, and this poor little guy was it was difficult for him. And finally, one year, Marshall said to him, I want you to read a book, because he was having trouble for some reason or another, and I don't know the whole story. It turns out he ends up becoming a professor of English, became a well-known author, a beautiful teacher, created the fictional writers, a nonfiction writers workshop in the University of Iowa. So, a totally wonderful human being in his own right, but very hard without having parents there to take care of you. They did have an aunt, actually like a cousin aunt of one of their parents, very loving woman, and she took care of him for a while. He kind of lived with her for a while. And then he was pretty much on his own. And he managed. He had an inner fortitude, and he really learned how to take care of himself, and at the same time be a loving, thoughtful person to everybody else. So Marshall was a very special human being, very special.
I got to meet him when we met at the Mount Madonna Center back in '96. I remember the two of you very clearly. Yeah. So I'd like to fill in a little more on the development of, I still remember the quote that if doulas were a drug, everyone would be on them. It was like, that was some kind of, I'm paraphrasing anyway, but that was one of his observations, I recall, and it stuck with me.
Yes, if doulas were a drug, every hospital would have one, that
Yeah.
had the results that the doula brought.
Yeah.
Now, how he got into becoming interested in that, that's a very special story. Do you want to hear that?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. He already had gotten parent-infant bonding going with very meticulous studies that took 2 years, every study. People with the baby, without the baby. You can't make a change in the nursery and only one group getting help and not the other. It was very complex studies. So now the doula, there were already some excellent studies behind the doula, and they had been done in Guatemala, and they were going to now be done in Houston. And I joined him, and we became connected and got married at the time that he started a whole new studies in America, because American obstetricians weren't that interested in studies that showed this excellent results from Guatemala. They said
Right.
American mothers are different. Well, I'll tell you, there's not that much difference from a pregnancy of this woman versus this woman. But anyhow, so they had a study. They got funding to do a study in America. They started it in Tampa. They had wonderful fellows of Marshall's. He had fellows from all over the world. And one fellow now was running the neonatal unit in Tampa, and they were able to get a study going there. Okay. I'm an observer. I'm in the nurse's office, and I'm just observing and listening. And the head nurse comes in one day and says, those doulas are fantastic. I can't get over how these mothers are managing labor with those doulas. I've asked all my nurses to do what the doulas do. What does that do to a study? In the study, you have people that just by chance, random envelope to this group, random envelope to that group. I happened to say to Marshall, I think there's something not going to work with this study. And I told him they had to stop the study in Tampa. And so they got another study going in Houston, which had a perfect environment. The Houston study had, people that could be easily divided into the normal care and the doula care. They also had a midwifery service. So they had wonderful midwives who had other groups of mothers. But I have to go back. Marshall did not only the bonding studies, he did breastfeeding studies, because he was trying to get mothers to breastfeed. And in American hospitals at that time, women were inundated with bottles of formula before they even left the hospital, thanks to Nestle, who just wanted to give them formula for the babies. And studies were being done on formula, but no formula mix had all the nutrients and things that breast milk had. They couldn't yet make that. They couldn't find a way to do that. And Marshall was really determined to show that breastfeeding was best. Okay, so Marshall and John, whenever they went to do a study, they always took students. They wanted students to have the experience, medical students or other social work, other students, to have the experience of doing studies and what it meant and the importance of it and the dedication to it. So in this particular summer, they had Wendy as one of the students. Wendy was a medical student at Case Western Reserve. I think she was a freshman student. She spoke Spanish. She was from California. She had some experience in anthropology with a famous anthropologist, Brigida Jordan, who wrote The Birth in Four Cultures. Brilliant book, brilliant, wonderful woman. So Wendy was so excited to come to be in the study. But her role in the study in Guatemala was simply to ask the mothers if they would like to be in the study without saying what it was. Nothing unusual, just a study. And they agreed. Either they agreed or they didn't agree, but it was still randomized. Wendy, warm-hearted, sweet, Spanish-speaking, kind, tender Wendy. It turns out, we find out later, when the women came in and were designated, they would be at dilatation of under 4 centimeters, no more than 4 centimeters, but right around there. And they then could be in the study and they could be in the labor room until they were actually ready to actually deliver the baby. And the hospital was geared like the strongest American hospital you ever saw. Everybody in caps and gowns, washed down, sterilized the delivery room after every delivery. Stirrups, women are up in these stirrups, very old way, but perfect of how it used to be in Philadelphia, in the first hospital in America. Okay, so they were following all the rules. Wendy's role was simply, would the woman be willing to join a study? Okay. At that time, the study was for breastfeeding because the babies were dying all over the world who were given formula. You know why? Because they mixed the formula with bad water.
Yeah.
And these babies would get diarrhea and they would die. They just died by the thousands. And a wonderful man, Dr. Darrell, and his wife, his daughter is living in the place where we're living right now. And he'd been a teacher at Yale, and Marshall knew him. He had developed a way to stop the diarrhea and to nourish these babies. So at least they had that. But Marshall wanted to get the babies on breast milk, which was much safer and better altogether. And everybody of the pediatricians and, John Kennel and others agreed with him. So how are you going to do this? So their goal was to get the mother early and get her on they had already done the bonding studies. And in the bonding studies, they looked at what happens if the mother gets the baby at 1 hour, within 1 hour after birth, within 1 day, within 2 days, within 3 days, a couple hours each day. These studies were meticulous. And then they found that if the lips of the baby touched the nipple of the mother within that 1 hour or so after birth, that mother nursed that baby, I think it was 100 hours longer. That may not seem like a lot to you, but I can tell you that change made a difference from the babies who were not connected with the mother for the first 5 days, except the normal hospital routine, which was every 4 hours the baby's brought out, given to the mother, generally with a bottle, or maybe breastfed, but not always necessarily. So when all those studies have been done, show that if the mother and the baby are together within the first hour, there's going to be a better result for breastfeeding. So this first doula observation, in quotes, was a breastfeeding study. And so Wendy, her job was to get the permission from the nice mother who's in labor, would you be willing to join a study? She got the people who, said yes. In the meantime, warm-hearted, kind, sweet, tender Wendy, she's got this mother who's suffering in labor. And the mother is in Spanish. She's saying, oh, mi espalda, my back. Oh, duele, it hurts, Wendy is saying, oh, I'm so sorry that hurts. Let me rub that a little bit. You're going to be okay. The baby's going to come soon. She's giving all these nice little phrases. She's not doing anything medical. She might be holding the hand. She might give a little massage on the hand. The woman says, my back hurts. She might rub the back a little bit. She's doing doula stuff without knowing anything about doulas. And she's just warm-hearted and kind. And these women, the charts all go to Marshall. Marshall doesn't see any of this. He looks at these charts. There's 10 charts that are very different from the other charts. And it turns out that 10 women, and we find out later that Wendy had been the one to talk with those women, delivered in the labor room very quickly, didn't even get to the delivery room. And in some 3 cases, milk was spurting from their breasts. I mean, and so Marshall's looking at these charts and he calls Wendy and he says, Wendy, do you happen to remember this woman, whatever the first name was, maybe, in this chart? But what do you tell me about this? And do you happen to remember what happened with this woman? He doesn't want to say, what did you do? He's very thoughtful. And Wendy said, oh, I remember. oh, that woman was so uncomfortable. I just thought I had to talk with her and have her feel better. Okay, now we're really into a whole other set of understanding. Marshall, being in who he is, was putting things together in his mind. I wonder if that kindness and that thoughtfulness and that little bit of help affected labor. And
Yeah.
exactly, duh is right. And so he talks with John about it, and they stopped the study. And they called the people who were funding the study, and they asked if they could change it and make a whole different study of, this effect. And at that point, they started to think what to call this. Well, there have been some very sensitive breastfeeding work done by Dana Raphael, wonderful, wonderful, thoughtful woman who did work in breastfeeding. That was her field. And she had gone to Greece and had seen this caring woman in Greek. The word doula, which is doula in our language, was a not a nice term. What's that word called? The negative
Pejorative.
pejorative. Thank you.
Yeah.
See, listen. The other day I was thinking of I'm doing some meridian tapping, and I couldn't think of the word meridian. I got I figured this is age. This is anyhow. So that was a pejorative word because in ancient Greece, the doula was a slave, but
Mhm.
she was there to serve the woman for breastfeeding and baby, care and birth and so on. So she probably helped the midwives and helped the woman in that way. But Marshall and John thought, let's ask Dana Raphael if we could use that word. And they did, and they got permission, but it's not a registered word. It's a known part of the language. It's like saying helper or something.
Mhm.
So when they first started to use it, and I went to Greece, I was invited to give some talks once. I talked about it, and they told me, the lovely therapist in Greek said, it's such a pejorative word. Now it's become a loving word, and they're writing their own books about doulas because we began to see that the concept of that kind of caring, compassionate, knowledgeable, helpful work is needed whenever anybody is in a down one position, ill, giving babies, going in the hospital, struggling with other things. Everybody could use a doula. And
Mhm.
we're even thinking of training doulas for other kinds of roles. But in the meantime, Marshall and John recognized that this made some difference and it was important to study. So the next 3 studies they did in Guatemala on the doula, and they found superb results. C-section rate from 18% down to 7. Need for medication way down. Right across the board, everything they've been looking at. And the mother feeling about the baby and about her partner. So those dynamics were so much affected. For example, women were asked how they feel about their partner at the same point in pregnancy. It was kind of not so good, but they were all the same. After those who had the doula, the mother would feel much better about the partner. Those who didn't have the doula would feel pretty discouraged. The partner didn't really know how to help them and was at all loss of it and so on. How they felt who was the best one to take care of their baby. They were rather than somebody else. If you didn't have that care, you didn't feel as confident in yourself. You didn't feel as valued in yourself. You felt awkward. You felt you weren't sure about yourself. So across the board, everything. One that really struck me, the women who had a doula were asked, both the women who had a doula and who didn't, all of these were asked across all the women. And how do you measure your baby against the standard baby? The ones who had a doula said, my baby is smarter, healthier, prettier than the standard baby. The ones who didn't have a doula said, my baby's almost as smart, almost as healthy, almost as pretty.
Mm.
That's huge, when you think about that. And so all along the way, and then um, now they wanted to, they looked at, length of labor, everything, all this. Then I thought this myself, but the funders said, you need to do a study where you're measuring, you need to have a person in the room. Is it, is it what the doula does, or is it that there's a person in the room, a different person, or an extra person in the room? So you have the normal care, which is where your interns and residents are going in and out and checking the mother as she's getting ready to deliver. You have the doula care, where you have the care of the woman, but you also have this extra person who's helping her, who's supporting her. By this time, they know, how to rub the back, how to say good things to her. And they called it the no talk, no touch doula. She was behind a screen, and but she was in the room. She only came out when somebody else came in the room, and her role was to mark down the nurse came in at 3:15, and then she goes back. She doesn't say anything. She's pleasant. She's not growly or anything. Just, she's pleasant, but she doesn't interact with the mother. They ask the women after the experiment, and it's all old. They asked the women from that group, of all the group, they said, what was it like? How was this for you? How was this experience for you? Of course, the people who had the doula were, it was very meaningful. I felt that somebody cared about me. The no talk, no touch doula women said, I felt so good having somebody interested in me in the room. She
Mm.
did nothing, but they showed that from being alone and
Yeah.
struggling with your labor, or that not we, but we asked to do a study, and it was done out of Rutgers. And that's one of the chapters in our third edition of the book, the doula book, is a friend or relative as a doula, because people, want to bring in somebody. And in most of our hospitals, you can bring somebody in, even with your husband, or if you don't have your husband, and if you don't have a doula, a friend or your mother. And it turned out that they looked at all the other results, and even being able to have somebody with you, even if she wasn't skilled in how to do doula stuff, those women, like there was again a good percentage of getting the help they needed, low percentage of C-section. A lot of this was looking at the what do we call the procedures that are done on women in labor. And the women who have the doula need hardly any. They trust their body, they trust their baby, they trust that they can do this, they have support to do it, and they have somebody with them through it. So, and the fathers, how did the fathers or partners feel? One father said, thank God we had the doula. It's like getting 6 lessons in football and then having to be in the Super Bowl. It's like,
Right.
so, when you think about all of this, it's really amazing. So every little thing had to be looked at and put into the pot. The one group, don't forget, these were all first-time mothers. So we wanted to be in a situation where we could get more experienced mothers, or mothers who had had C-sections, or, other situations, like across the board, everyday people, but who had already had a baby. And this study, John was able to do in Cleveland, because he was still there with all the, the OB department and so on. Marshall and I were now in Michigan, in East Lansing at Michigan State. And Marshall and John can discuss what they were both wanting to look for. So we met often with them. And we had already met every other week at a beautiful place in Upper Michigan, in Traverse City, actually, to write the first book, which was called Mothering the Mother. It was my idea to write the book, because I said, we've got to get this information to the public. It can't be, and most people aren't reading studies. So I said, let's write a book and let's call it Doula. yay. And then nobody knew what that word meant. It'd be like Jaws or something. And and so the editor, I wrote one of the chapters on the emotional issues of the doula, and I thought of it as the doula mothers the mother. And if the mother had had poor mothering and she came from difficult circumstances, it might be a way to remother the mother. So anyhow, the editor said, why don't we call the book Mothering the Mother? So that was nice. And after that, it became known, the doula became known, and she said, you should just call it the doula book. But I think we should have left the name Mothering the Mother. I think that's nicer,
Yeah, it says it all. Yeah.
It really does say it.
I'm
And
curious how the original studies wound up being in Guatemala. What was the connection there?
they had a wonderful fellow, Juan, oh, I'm embarrassed. I know him. I even stayed with, they were from Uruguay, wonderful people. And also Roberto, who was from Guatemala. He was a fellow too. So different fellows were from Latin America. And I think this was Roberto's help. He said, let's use this hospital, which is very modern. They have all the modern ways of helping women give birth. It would be a good example. And since they started at breastfeeding, they were open to that. If we now can change it to a doula study, because you've got the same cohort of women from the villages around, and you have a setup that really is a typical hospital setup, like America. So if the doula works here, maybe it'll then be transferred more easily to the States to make change. So that's how they started. They got permission from World Health, they got permission from the hospital. They had the fellow who was great, Roberto Sosa, who knew all the people. But it was interesting when they spent the summer there with, working the program, and they had students. They also had guerrillas shooting outside the house where they all lived. So there was always civil wars going on, which wasn't always quite so safe. But anyhow.
Now, you mentioned a funding source that
they had Robert Johnson funded, they had the National Institute of Health funding, because this was really reducing the cost of C-sections way down. If you have 5 to 7% C-sections versus 18 to 20, it's a big difference, a huge amount. And C-sections at that time could be $20,000. Now they're even more from what I understand. You lower the need for all kinds of interventions, and then you get breastfeeding started early. You have, so a lot of these things could be put together when you have a healthy birth with less interventions. So that was one consideration, and also the better relationship of the baby to the mother and the baby to the partner.
So you had the studies in Guatemala, and then you tried it in Tampa, but the nurse messed that one up. Then you did it in Houston.
Houston, I think 3 or 4 studies in Houston. And then John followed through on another study in Houston in terms of the relationship to the baby at 6 weeks later. And they followed up, and these were the researchers who came in to interview the mothers did not know which group they were in. And this was another study in how they felt about the baby, how breastfeeding was going, how they responded. And across the board, having a doula made a difference in the mother's relationship to the baby. So this was very important to Marshall and John, that the mother felt more bonded to the baby, more tender toward the baby, and felt better about herself, how she felt about herself as a person. So just, these are very important things in terms of how children are raised developmentally. From this, many studies grew. The University of Africa, South Africa, with Witherspoon, wonderful studies came out of. They did a lot of follow-up studies on the relationship of mother-baby, and I wish I had the name of all of them now. Beverly Chalmers, one of the doctors, professors, I'm sorry, wonderful, wonderful man. They created all new studies with all new, some that were following what had been done with the American group simply that reconfirmed their what they discovered and added. So throughout the world, other studies were being done. And by the time we were writing the third edition, I think there were, I think 28 studies, 5,000 women studied. I mean, you know, this was really real. This was not just a figment that happened one time. And I'm probably wrong on my numbers, and I should correct that before you discuss this with anybody. But it really began to change how people thought about this kind of help for women. It used to be what women got way back in the
Of
frontier
course.
days. You know,
Yeah.
you had midwives, and the midwife would often come with a helper midwife, and or the mother in the family or somebody would, you know, be there.
Yeah.
And all of this fell away when obstetrics took over all of birth, and the obstetricians really felt the only way we're going to get this role is if we get rid of all these other, the midwife, and we get rid of all these other people. They don't speak English anyhow. Most of the midwives in the early 1900s were from foreign countries, you know, were immigrants.
Didn't know
And
that. Huh.
yeah, and so the obstetricians wanted this field, you know, and of course they developed all the drugs and all the ways that the stirrups and things
Yeah.
that are, you know, one doctor that I know, he said, imagine a baby trying to come out in a stovepipe, you know, so rather than having the mother upright and with support, so the gravity works, you know,
Yeah.
and the body works better. You know, you have the woman all twisted up in those stirrups and oh my gosh, on her back and in pain and yeah,
Crazy.
yeah, it is. So that's pretty much the story.
Well, now
We do it.
we've talked a lot about Marshall and John, and unfortunately they're not with us to be interviewed. You filled in some
Yeah.
of Marshall's background. Can you fill in a little more about John and how he got involved in this?
Yeah, John, um, his parents, I think he had his parents for a long time, and but they ended up actually with Alzheimer's, but they lived quite old. But I do know that John, I think, was trained either in Rochester or Harvard, and he came to Cleveland when he's 5 years older than Marshall, and when he came to Cleveland, he was like a teacher, you know, for the residents.
Mhm.
And he and Marshall and John really hit it off. They both were sharing, you know, their interests in babies. And I think Marshall was the head resident at one point. Of this, I don't really know. I do know that there was a cute story about them when Marshall was working at Stanford and bringing babies and mothers together before they were allowed to do that. And John was sneaking mothers into the neonatal nursery in Cleveland. And people who were watching them or knew about them were starting to tell this story. These two men are sneaking the mothers in so they could be with their babies, but it's not permitted. You know? So anyhow, they both had big hearts for this work and
Mhm.
absolutely so tender minded and so in, you know, and they just fit like glove and two gloves, you know, hand in glove. So they never argued. They just were very respectful of each other. I might come in pipe in, what do you think about this? Wait a minute, you know, this pipsqueak over here trying to get a word in. And they were very respectful of me. They really let me have my 2 cents. And I think in the long run, I could fill in some of the, you know,
Yeah,
the other
you
emotional interactions.
provided a whole different perspective for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm curious, was Benjamin Spock was in Cleveland too, and
Yes,
had to undo
yes.
a lot of his stuff. I was a Spock baby. Did they have any interaction or
Oh,
connection?
absolutely. They communicated often with Ben Spock, and you know, they were all very friendly and they shared ideas. And I wasn't part of that, but I've only heard. And I have a friend who was a Spock baby, and she and her children were Spock babies. So she said, you know, they were interviewed all the time, and they had to share all kinds of feelings and experiences, and they loved it. You know, they loved having that experience. So they kind of represent, I'm sure, all the families who felt the same. But Marshall and John were very close to Ben Spock, and they would talk about him. And I think I felt bad not really knowing him, but that was a rich part of their thinking. Marshall did a lot of other things. He participated and listened to they had a therapeutic nursery school as part of the training of therapists working with children. What's her name? Anna Freud came to Cleveland, spent weeks in Cleveland and giving her observations. And she would work on, Marshall met her and had opportunity to communicate with her. He was, just a resident then, and he learned a great deal from her. And Freud's grandson, oh, I'm so embarrassed. He spent time with me and Marshall, and he was studying the lungs and breathing, and he was a very good researcher. He's a lovely young man, not young, he was a little man, so sweet. And like many British, he had one little tiny bag which had all his possessions in when he traveled. And he came to where my apartment was when Marshall and I had just gotten married. And I'll think of his name. Hopefully I'll fill it in later. But
that was Sigmund's grandson, you said.
Sigmund's grandson.
Oh, we can look that up.
Yes, very, very kind, sweet. They were all very thoughtful people. This was a way of sort of being present and interested in you and wanting to share thoughts. But I was amazed that Marshall spent many times in that little nursery school watching how children evolved and children with problems. Another person who came, who was part of his education, he was very open to all kinds of knowledge about human development, was Selma Freiberg.
Oh, yeah.
And she was a very big influence for Marshall. And he had time with her and communication and, her way of doing therapy, which was so delicate and sensitive. And of course, read her work. So he was a very open-minded person. And this is why I think he was so responsive to me, where I would describe a mother that was having trouble with a baby. And, they were, of course, interested in that. And I said, let me tell you what I found out, in interviewing the mother and going back in her life story. And she had been traumatized as a child. And and she had been abused, and she had many other anxieties. And so when she had this, she was in a first marriage for her, second marriage for her husband, who was much older, very kind man, very responsive, but totally uninterested in babies. And he kept saying, when the kid can catch a baseball, I'm going to be the best dad, And in the meantime, she is struggling and getting very depressed. And I saw her with the baby, and the baby, as she's talking to me, the baby is so engrossed in her face, so listening to her. She never noticed. She said, I can't get the baby to look at me. He doesn't see me. I don't think he knows me. And the baby is looking right at her, and she's not seeing it, And so my work was to help her be able to see the real baby and not overplay her own loss that she had never being seen as a baby. So that's the kind of piece that, I could share with John and Marshall, and they were very interested in my clients and how I helped them through processing and healing their own early losses. So not that they didn't believe that would be so, but their work as a pediatrician, they couldn't do all of that, and I couldn't do their pediatric work. So it was a nice blending,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Back to Spock for a minute. I was on a 4-hour bottle schedule when I was born, and
Yes.
2 weeks in the hospital. My understanding is that Spock started out with that kind of, like, he really followed in J.D. Watson's much more negative parenting, but then he softened up around that. So what's your...
Well, this is very interesting because when John and Marshall were doing their studies on breastfeeding to get babies on the breast, and they had one of their fellows, Marshall's fellow, 35 fellows, this is Manuel de Carvalho from Brazil, they had him, they wanted to get breastfeeding and prove that breastfeeding was better. Well, you have to show how much milk the baby's getting. And with bottle feeding, you can show that, but you
Yeah.
can't show it with breast. So Marshall had Manuel measure the baby's, weigh the baby with these measurements that were to the minuscule of the ounce, with a diaper on. And so before and after feeding, and you could see how much the milk the baby got by the weight of the diaper, the baby with the diaper. And so Manuel would go into the house, the mothers, and spend hours there, and after feedings measured and found, and then somebody else had done a study. They took like a balloon of the size of a baby's stomach, and they held it in the way that it would be moving the milk out from the breast milk or from the bottle. And they saw that within, I think it was like 40 minutes or 38 minutes or something, the stomach would be empty of the milk. And so to wait 4 hours was completely wrong, So then when they practiced demand feed, like when the baby showed hunger to give the baby milk, they showed that if the baby had 9 to 11 feedings in 24 hours versus the 6, that baby would grow much faster and have much more milk, and they noted something else. Not only would the baby grow faster and um, and actually get more milk, but what was the other point I wanted to bring in? Grow faster and wait a minute. Oh, this was also very interesting. At that time, there was a pediatrician, I think in Missouri, and I have to look up his name again. I used to know it on the tip of my tongue all the time. He studied that if a baby had like I think 3 to 5 mouth at the breast suckling within the first 5 hours of life, that baby would never have jaundice. The meconium would come out early. If the baby got that suckling very early, within the first 5 hours. And I don't know if it was 2 sucklings or 3, whatever it was, within that first 5 hours with the mother and baby together, letting the baby call the shots kind of thing. Those babies did not have jaundice. So what nature provided, what was so natural, but keeping the baby in the nursery away from the mother and bringing it out every 4 hours, it missed that time of getting the meconium out, and you got a jaundiced baby, and which of course is from the meconium, which is in the jaundice, whatever the substance is, it's called. What is the substance?
Bilirubin.
Yes, thank you, bilirubin, is in the meconium and needs to get out. And so thank you, who's ever up there trying to call on the shots, it's
It was
trying
a
to,
good design until we started messing with it.
right.
So did
So
Spock get more supportive of breastfeeding as a result of?
yeah, I'm sure, I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure he did. And
Yeah.
I'm going to ask Wendy, who probably knows a little bit, and she's a psychiatrist, child psychiatrist now, all grown up, of course. But anyhow, I think that as these studies came in, people like Spock would say, wow, this is important, let's do it. But you have to prove these things to change the nursery rules.
Yeah.
Marshall used to say, the nursery's like a fortress. And, they did 3 other studies. Because they were criticized at every point. Well, there's too many germs. Only the mothers, only the nurses can handle the mothers. Well, if there was a infection in the nursery, the truth is they closed the nursery and put all the babies with the mothers. Then I think it was either Juan or Roberto who took the measurement of the nose of the baby and the mother and the umbilical cord to look at the bacteria, which were the natural ones of the mother and baby, and they were always the same. So the baby was safer on the mother than being separate from the mother. And one of them was they had cholera in their countries, and they had all these other problems because they didn't keep the babies and mothers together, and they used that formula with the bad water. So when the mother's bacteria were the same as the baby, the baby's safer right there. So rooming in was better. Free breastfeeding whenever the baby wanted it. You know, I mean, write down the list of all the reasons why the baby should be with the mother. The mother feels closer to the baby.
Mhm.
Oh, I didn't tell you this story. So part of the system, this is, every little thing fits this puzzle. You know, you have this big puzzle. You see a piece. Where does it go? Anyhow, because the babies were in the nursery, the nurses become very sensitive to the babies, and they respond all the time. And this is, let's say it's the sick nursery, the preemies. And by the way, the babies weren't always so sick. They just were small, some of them. You had
Mhm.
to be 5 pounds before you went home, okay? So one day, um, I think it's could have been the nurse who told me this story. Anyhow, the nurse is feeding this baby, and the baby is doing really well, getting bigger and stronger. But it's time for the mother to start to feed the baby. This is all by bottle feeding. Excuse me. And she's having trouble doing it. So this very nice nurse goes to Marshall and says, Dr. Klaus, or Professor Klaus, this mother's having trouble feeding this baby. The baby takes the bottle so easily from me. I don't know what the trouble is. Could you see? And Marshall was so much of an observer, and everybody knew this about him. And so in this little room, which is sort of the going home room, when the baby is the right size, they have the mother and baby together for 24 hours with support from the nursing staff. And she's now going to be taking care of her own baby, so she'll be somewhat familiar with the baby when she goes home the next day. So here's his mother with, with her baby. And there's 2 rocking chairs in this room. The baby is in one, the mother is in one with her baby, and Marshall sits in the other. And he doesn't say too much at all. And he's just noticing the mother's holding the baby, and she puts the bottle in the baby's mouth. Baby starts sucking. She pulls the bottle out. And she does this 2 or 3 times. And then she says, and Marshall's just very sort of quietly observing and listening. She says, "Are you mine? Are you mine?" You know, she puts the bottle in and out, says that about 2 or 3 times. The next time she does it, she says, "Are you alive?" Marshall just, he remembers, he didn't want to sound shocked in front of her. He was so upset. And right in his head, he said, what are we doing to these mothers? And he left, and this mother, I think he spoke to her and he listened to her. I don't know the further story about that. But knowing him, he made sure that she was getting some help. He then makes a decision. We have to do a study on what to have these mothers and babies together. You can't change the nursery without a study. And,
Mhm.
in his mind, let's get these babies to these mothers, You have to prove that that's better for the babies and the mothers.
So that led to that study then.
Major study.
Yeah.
And he got other psychologists, psychiatrists, and social workers, people who were interested with him to make the study. And these take a couple years because you can't have half the people in the nursery with their mother and half without.
Mhm.
That would be horrible.
Mhm.
You have to get that nursery completely cleared of that group, and then you do the next thing. So it took 2 years, and then they were able to show that when the mother has the baby in the nursery, they get better faster, they grow faster, and by the way, other people were looking at nurseries. Tiffany Field was doing massage of the small preemies. I mean, these things all followed in the appropriate
Mhm.
order, but babies who were massaged. very gently as preemies, or just even a little bit, they grew faster, they took in more milk. They all took in the same amount of milk, by the way, excuse me. They grew faster. Why did they grow faster?
Mhm.
They found out that the hormones, that if the baby gets more milk, and the hormones like cholecystokinin, I think it's called, the hormones that make the villi, when the baby's massaged, the villi of the intestines grow longer, so that baby can absorb more nutrients from the food
Mhm.
than the other baby. I mean, nature is so amazing, and this is nature's to keep these babies safe during famine. The mother and the baby's villi grow stronger and longer, both when they're fed more, or they're massaged. So it's just, it all fits. So
Yeah.
it's fascinating, really.
Wow, we've had quite a journey with you. This is
Yeah.
wonderful. And in wrapping up, do you have any parting words for future generations that we hope will find value in us old folks and our history, and how these things, I hope, will be commonplace in future generations, that we're documenting how they began?
Oh, I do want to mention the Swedish wonderful Dr. Kerstin Uvnäs Moberg, wonderful physician and a physiologist. They were very interested in the bonding studies and the breastfeeding studies, and they had wonderful midwives. And she created a study with them, because this is an important piece. They were interested in how the baby finds the breast. A
Hmm.
lot of breastfeeding was done with the breastfeeding consultants would come in and smash the baby on the breast. And babies hate that. Another thing that was done to our babies, they would take a bulb and try to, clear the baby's mouth. Or,
Suction, yeah.
right, the suction, or try to even go further down if they worried if the baby wasn't going to breathe. And these horrible things would gag the baby. Some babies had a terrible reaction. There's a word called where they kind of lose, the heartbeat goes down. It's dangerous to do this, something in the throat. Look at me, I'm losing the word.
Vasovagal response?
Yes, thank you. See, vasovagal, exactly, that's it. Very damaging and very dangerous. And Marshall found that if you just wipe the mouth of the, you seal anything, don't put anything in the mouth. That was so destructive to the baby nursing. Smashing the baby on the breast is destructive to the nursing. So the midwives and Kerstin did a study to see, what does the baby do if you don't interfere with it. You dry the baby, of course, after the birth. You make sure the baby really everything's going all right. You take 5-10 minutes maybe. The mother feels ready to take on the baby. Sometimes she needs a little time to kind of regroup after the birth. And you dry the chest and you dry the baby, because you don't put a cold baby. A lot of people don't realize the baby uses a lot of energy to have to get itself warm if it's wet, So you dry the baby. That can be done in 30 seconds with warm towels. And so you just put the baby on the chest and see what the baby does. And they did such wonderful, sensitive work. We were invited to Sweden. Marshall gave some talks, and I did also. And they showed us the films that they took of what the baby does to find the breast. And this ended up being the breast crawl, which maybe you've heard of.
Mm-hmm.
And they saw that babies did a whole bunch of different things. They, it's really fun. I could show you with our little film clip, but
Seen them there. It's
you
impressive.
have seen them. It's really exciting to see this, and it's fun for the mother. So if you place the baby and you put your hands underneath, so the baby can push against your hands, as well as the baby pushes against the abdomen, which helps the uterus contract. And so again, this is a good thing. The baby's pressing down, the uterus is starting to contract back to its normal size, and the baby is sorting out the positioning that it's going to like to latch on. It elongates the nipple. It checks the different nipple. So what Marshall has said, dry the baby except for the hands, because the smell of the amniotic fluid or there's little oil on the side of the breast, whatever might be, and let the baby go for the smell, because the smell is the most primitive
Hmm.
scent, and babies will have that, get that. And then the baby's going to test one nipple and another, and in the meantime, it's going to baby look at the mother, because the baby is going to want to put the face to the voice that the baby knows, and the whole thing works. And so it's really fun to see what the baby does. The baby might be elongating one breast and suckling on the other. It might switch and change. And the midwives found that the babies have kind of a process of checking it out. And then they finally get on in a very good way on the areola. I never pronounce it wrong. Areola, I think that's it. Anyhow, and they get a good latch. And if you get them on without that, they get on the end of the nipple, and that's painful. So I think everything was made to work. And what
Yeah.
I appreciate about Marshall and John, also is they were so sensitive to all of this. They were so respectful of it. They wanted it to work the way nature intended. And they had such appreciation of the mother's role and the baby's role and the partner. And when but they had to study each thing to make it be a reality in the mind of the
Yeah.
public and of the other caregivers. And that's where they did a service that was very important. And it is
Right.
important, because if you just did something and it really wasn't helpful, you throw everything off again. So I had a great deal of respect for the kind of research they did, and their hearts were in it. And I knew them in such a profound way. I felt really blessed, really blessed. And I
Yeah.
miss both of them, and I miss Marshall every day, because he would have been so interested in the new things that we're discovering about the mind, the heart, and the
Mm.
soul in the holistic ways that we're looking now. And I feel very blessed that I have that.
Well, thank you. I'm touched, just even more than I already was aware of getting these details. So,
Thank you
wow.
for letting me share.
Thank
I
you so
really
much.
appreciate it. Much love, and
Okay.
be well. Thank
Same to
you.
you. Bye.
Bye.